Good evening. I'm Diana Buddy. I'm Associate Professor of Art here at the University of Wisconsin, Marathon County. And we are so honored to have Patricia Johansen as our artist in residence this year. Her work graces the pages of art history surveys alongside artists such as Christo and Jean-Claude, Robert Smithson, and Nancy Holt. Her work bridges divides between art and architecture, ecology and infrastructure, as well as visual and physical experience. When thinking about what a residency my students would have with Patricia Johansen, I immediately thought of Monk Gardens. And I contacted Paul Whitaker, a biology professor here, and a Monk Gardens board member. He and Darla Zastro, who also teaches here at UWMC, have been working with the generous donation of 20 acres of land by Robert W. Monk. Monk's vision was to use the land to teach young people about the importance of interacting with nature and plant life, especially through gardening. And that was Mr. Monk's passion. So when Patricia Johansen was here, my drawing students had designed a bridge, a memorial, and a tree house of their choice for the gardens. They had toured them, they had sketched the gardens, and they thought they had the tour given by Paul Whitaker, so they knew a little bit of the background. And so they thought about some of the issues and designed some ideas. And we're going to turn those over to Monk Gardens board and have them look at them. My painting students also toured Monk Gardens and took several pictures of the gardens, and then they layered these experiences on top of one another in paintings. And when Patricia Johansen was in the classroom with these students, she looked them over and gave some really nice feedback. Some examples of the work of my students are in the little gallery right here in the CCE building. So after the lecture, it'd be nice if you went and took a look. They also wrote about their ideas and their reactions to what Patricia Johansen said to them. So please join me and welcome probably one of the most famous artists to ever come to Wausau, Patricia Johansen.
During the late 1960s, I began studying nature, hoping to discover how beautiful, daring, almost unimaginable forms mesh seamlessly with efficient multiple functions. The answers seemed to lie in considering not just the object, but also the environment, the entire complex within which the object lived, as well as the forces that might transform it. And this drawing from 1969, called Water Gathering Sculptures, is an early effort to synchronize aesthetic form, function, and environmental context. It was inspired by desert potholes, ephemeral basins that collect snowmelt and water from infrequent rains. These forms also have an ecological component because they support communities of insects, snails, amphibians, and crustaceans, such as tiny fairy shrimp, and provide drinking water for larger animals. And then I've looked at larger structures to see how water flows off the land and used the form of the centipede as an analogy for smaller rivulets conveying runoff to a main channel. And similarly, the segmented body of the fairy shrimp is translated into a series of water steps that convey water to a perennial basin at the lowest level, the head of the shrimp. This image fills and empties with changing water levels, supporting colonies of living fairy shrimp, and the steps can be used by humans and wildlife to access the lowest basin as the water supply shrinks. And finally, I've oriented the main channels north and south, with the south-facing slope undercut so that the water is shaded under a natural roof. and the bottoms of the channels are concave to hold cold night air. So I've tried to create a design that is simultaneously functional, sculptural, life-supporting, and informed by nature's principles and intelligence. From the beginning, I've tried to shape a dialogue between art and specific local environments, and I've always been more concerned about how my projects function than about how they look, offering a great deal of freedom to simply choose models that work. This drawing, called Moss Garden, Villi, the Protective Sponge, also from 1969, envisions a project that is simultaneously environmental sculpture, public garden, wildlife corridor, and major infrastructure. Like much of my work, it is based on a biological model, intestinal villi, which provide an enormous surface area for absorbing digested food. Since the purpose of the design is erosion control, a hillside, perhaps along a highway, is covered with planted gabions, and those are just those rock-filled mesh boxes that you'll sometimes see. And this provides an enormous surface area for absorbing rainwater, while the sculptural configurations block any direct route through the maze, slowing floodwater and preventing gullying. From an aesthetic perspective, the model is Chinese landscape painting and the sense of wandering through the Pinnacle Mountains with their serpentine rivulets and deep ravines. And finally, it is the union of this specific environment interacting with man-made forms that creates the aesthetic experience, which goes far beyond the visual. The cool, moist air, the green reflected light, the sounds of dripping water, the scurrying of amphibians that rely on such environments for their survival, and the unavoidable encounter with squishy substrate and the botanical details of bryophytes. In 1981, I was invited to design an environmental sculpture for Fair Park Lagoon in Dallas. It was apparent that the lagoon was environmentally degraded. The shoreline was eroded and the water was murky. Fertilizer from the lawn washed into the lagoon every time it rained, causing algal bloom. There were few birds, no waterfowl, and hardly any plants, animals, or fish. In fact, the Dallas Museum of Natural History had declared the site biologically dead. I began by developing my own list of concerns, which included creating functioning ecosystems and providing living exhibits for the Dallas Museum of Natural History. Lining the shoreline with cypress knees helped control bank erosion, and creating paths over water allowed people to become immersed in the life of the lagoon. I also began to research what different animals eat because food plants and nesting materials attract wildlife. This is the model. Eventually, 2 Texas plants were chosen as models for the sculptures because their forms coincided with the strategy of the design. The Delta duck potato, Sagittaria platyphila, had a mass of twisted roots that I arranged to prevent water from eroding the shoreline. And this drawing, called Shoreline Stabilization, shows how sculptural elements are used as lines of defense and deployed along the water's edge to prevent waves from reaching the shoreline, which had previously been eroding at the rate of 8 inches a year. So if you look on the drawing at the red segments and think about, kind of chorus line like the Rockettes, and how they shift their patterns back and forth across the stage. If you would draw all of those red lines up into one line, you'd see that they form a continuous barrier across the lagoon. And then, so that's what prevents the shoreline erosion. And then if you look at the purple segments, those are what are called bank armoring. So basically, you're deploying your aesthetic elements in the places where erosion was occurring. Spaces between these sculptural elements became microhabitats for plants, fish, turtles, and birds. And I'd also like to point out one other thing that I always do. Because I was trained as a painter and very interested in Impressionist painting, if you see that purple puddle, it really isn't there. That's optical color. It's mixing in your eye. So exactly the way when the Impressionists would put 2 spots of color together, say a yellow and a red, and you'd get a very intense orange. What's happening there is the blue of the sky is mixing with the terracotta substrate of the sculpture. And I do that in all of my outdoor projects as well. And so what happened is these elements are now used as an outdoor exhibit and teaching facility by the Dallas Museum of Natural History. The roots of the plant were built as 5-foot wide paths that people could walk on, while thinner stems rose above the water as perches for birds. Leaves further out in the lagoon became islands for animals, while others along the shore formed step seating and overlooks. And finally, children tend to use both sculptures as a playground that combines running and climbing with exploration and discovery. A second sculpture at the opposite end of the lagoon was based on a Texas fern, Pteris multifida. The spine and leaflets of the plant were twisted to create bridges, causeways, and islands, while cut-out shapes between the walkways became small-scale water landscapes, flower basins, and fish ponds. And you can see that duckweed. Again, this is what feeds the waterfowl. And now, more than 25 years later, pond cypress trees provide a shady canopy over the entire sculpture. Biological restoration was a key element in the design of Fair Park Lagoon. Snails, clams, freshwater sponges, and shrimp, fish, reptiles, and waterfowl are both decorative and members of the food chain. Landscaping was chosen for food and habitat value, so this is an area where the birds can nest. A littoral zone of plants that root in shallow water was created around the edge of the lagoon to stabilize the banks, reduce turbidity, and provide nesting sites. The amount of nutrients available to algae was reduced and water quality improved. And when I first arrived there, this was just a body of water that was totally covered with algae. Flocks of wild birds began to arrive, and today the lagoon teems with life, including many rare nesting birds that had never been seen before in this public park. Few would suspect that this is a functional flood basin with an educational agenda, as sculpture provides human access to a functioning ecosystem that continuously evolves. Fair Park Lagoon was a very conscious effort to recreate a freshwater swamp in the middle of Dallas. Some of the most interesting and poetic aspects of the design are directly due to its function, such as when heavy rains drown segments of the paths, necessitating alternate routes. Water fluctuations, which periodically flood and reveal the sculpture, create a transient world of reflected nature and are due to the fact that the lagoon is a flood basin for the Trinity River. Plants and animals, insects and amphibians living in ecological communities animate the landscape and provide magical sights and sounds, but are low maintenance due to the fact that they are all part of the food chain. And because the structures are based on actual plants, people who walk the paths follow the varying curves and rhythms of the biological forms, repeating the patterns of the living plant. Fair Park Lagoon provides a powerful connection to the living world while also fulfilling all the functional requirements of an engineered municipal flood basin. So during the 60s, when I first began studying nature by drawing plants and other living creatures, I began to categorize nature's structures and strategies. One principle seemed to be using sculptural topography to create microclimates, which may now be especially relevant due to climate change. And these drawings are all from the 1969 series commissioned by House and Garden magazine. The ventilated structures seen in Sculpture Garden Shelter were thought of as homeless shelters with warm interior spaces that draw in fresh air by mimicking the chimney-like circulation patterns seen in termite mounds. And again, so taking sculpture, turning it into something very functional, and actually using it within cities instead of the kind of monumental sculpture that was being plopped in plazas throughout New York City. And that's what this was in response to. And then Ridges and Furrows, Coastal Fog, was inspired by the fact that many plants and animals gather water directly from fog, which condenses on their body. This headstander beetle from the desert flips up to allow water to trickle down troughs in its back and into its mouth. So basically what it does is in the cool night air, it allows the water to gather. Then as the sun rises, before the water can evaporate, it flips up and drinks the water. And these kinds of natural strategies led me to look at urban design in a way that was quite different from the contemporary and prevailing international style, which was sleek, geometric, and lifeless. Okay, first problem. Oh, there we go. The building that collects water deploys spongy forested roofs as aerial parks that collect rainwater, which drains into an underground cistern where it is collected and reused within the building. And building that cleans its own water removes air and water pollution by trickling water down limestone cliffs filled with ferns and mosses. In the process, this creates a cool, moist climate, as well as a unique urban garden, a public canyon with rock climbing walls and cliff walks. Living apartment houses is inspired by the architecture of landforms, and the idea is not to impose human design on the landscape, but rather, like Native American and animal structures, to find ways to fit in. The entire complex is vegetated, designed as walkable terraces, and enlists the earth for climate control. It also becomes a park where natural topography and microhabitats provide connectivity from one ecosystem to another. So basically, right after I was a student and really didn't have any ability to build anything, I was basically working out ideas on these little pieces of paper. So the final little drawing from 1969, Municipal Water Gardens Channels, is one of a number of sketches I made dealing with sewage treatment as wildlife habitat and public space. As a designer, I've always been interested in integrating large-scale infrastructure with community use, wildlife sustenance, art, and economic development. Ellis Creek Water Recycling Facility in Petaluma, California, combines oxidation ponds, treatment wetlands, and polishing ponds with a 272-acre tidal marsh and mudflat, and is known as Petaluma Wetlands Park. I worked on this project with Carollo engineers, initially as a member of the value engineering team. In Petaluma, art and infrastructure, ecological nature, and the public landscape are unified within the image of one of the area's smallest inhabitants, the salt marsh harvest mouse, with its tail linked to recycled water reservoirs, a butterfly pond within the mouse's body, which you can see on the right, and a morning glory flower that processes stormwater before it enters the Petaluma Marsh. At the heart of the wetlands park, 4 elevated bermed ponds totaling 45 acres form the mouse's image. 12-foot wide truck access routes along the top of earthen berms simultaneously contain the pond water and provide more than 3 miles of public trails. And these trails frame the processing of human sewage, the tidal cycle with its ever-changing patterns of land and water, and the complex relationships between creek, marsh, tidal sloughs, and stormwater runoff. Habitat islands in each sewage treatment cell offer protected nesting habitat and refuge for birds, and vegetation and substrate varies in each of the ponds in order to attract a wide range of species. However, these wildlife islands are also a vital engineering component since they are deployed to direct the flow of water in the basins. Within each pond, zones of dense filtering vegetation, aided by microbial decomposers that live on the plant's roots and stems, filter, break down, and consume suspended solids and heavy metals. These green zones alternate with blue zones of deeper open water. And in these open water zones, sunlight encourages the growth of algae that produce oxygen, Wave action further aerates the water, and mosquito-eating fish are in turn preyed upon by fish-eating waterfowl. So again, you know, if you ever design any wetlands projects, you need to deal with mosquito abatement, and they're actually mosquito abatement districts. And so these all become components in the design. A grape arbor and pavilion in the mouse's right ear provide shady seating and concealed bird blinds. And this is a construction shot, while the left ear forms amphitheater seating for tour groups and classes from the Petaluma Public Schools, which use the facility as part of their environmental and science curriculums. I'm sorry, these are construction shots, but you'll get the scale of it. Another component of this project that transforms with the seasons is Morning Glory pools. Set between a business park, the polishing wetlands, and the Petaluma Marsh, the flower processes stormwater from Lakeville Highway and business parking lots through a series of bioswales, sediment ponds, and shallow vegetated pools. The petals are compartmentalized to create varying colors, textures, and habitats, with plantings targeted to the removal of specific pollutants. The Morning Glory was planted with 16,000 wetlands plants, and the patterns can be seen from the elevated polishing pond berms. The scalloped edge of the butterfly pond forms beaches and roosts for wildlife, and a small shelter, the head of the butterfly, provides a gathering place for community groups. 2-point access paths connect the polishing pond berm with Ellis Creek, where the acorn leaching, fish traps, seed gathering, and marsh hunting of the original Miwok residents are interpreted. And you can see the riparian corridor over there, that's the creek. A great effort has been made to attract wildlife to this facility by providing a wide range of food and habitat, foraging and nesting sites, and the wildlife has arrived, including 8 threatened and endangered species that have chosen to make this their home. And again, this is something I always try to do. I mean, California Fish and Game, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, you know, are so concerned about trying to preserve the California clapper rail, provide habitat for it. But it's really simple if you do other projects. If you provide the food and habitat, they move in. And that's how, when we started with nothing, we ended up with 8 endangered and threatened species, including the California clapper rail that's in the tidal sloughs. And this family of river otters that moved into one of the polishing ponds continues to attract human visitors, while the red-tailed hawk, who hunts from the tops of trees along Ellis Creek, has discovered a bountiful feast, including this endangered mouse. And again, I don't ever try to protect anything. What I try to do is create the whole ecosystem so that it balances itself. And that's the only way that, that you can really, I think, have a successful project when you're dealing with wildlife. Boda's pocket gopher is often seen burrowing along the trails, and I didn't include the slide or the picture of the gopher snake, which is 5 feet long and also patrols the trails going after this little gopher. While birds are so diverse and numerous, including many rare and endangered species, that several local groups, as well as the Audubon Society, conduct tours of the site. By designing the landscape as life-supporting ecological communities, the project has already stimulated measurable economic development. Tourists as well as locals walk the trails regularly. A new Sheraton Hotel has been built overlooking the sewage treatment facility, with trails down to the sewage processing. And the world-famous Point Reyes Bird Observatory has relocated its headquarters to Petaluma. The project has also been designed to showcase California agriculture, as in the Mousetail Trail, which provides human visitors with an intimate experience of local animals, migrating birds, and cultivated crops. And surprisingly, the facility has attracted a wide range of unexpected users, including recreational boaters, and artists. And one day I came there, and there were probably 50 artists, you know, about 25 with their easels set up, and others going through this really large facility with their sketchbooks. Many people assume that my images are added at the end after all the basic engineering and environmental design has been completed, whereas actually they grow organically as solutions to design problems. In this case, the circulation of water, which primarily flows by gravity, and the sewage treatment train. And one of the interesting things about this project is the engineering team produced 7 alternatives, 6 of which were mechanical systems with different alternatives. This was the only wetland system. This was the design, basically, of me and the wetlands biologist, Bob Gearhart from Arcata State University. And so one of the reasons this project was selected by the city is because it was the cheapest to build and it was the cheapest to operate. And the guiding factor there is that all of this water flows by gravity. If you look at those little white things at the end of each pond, those are the water transfer structures. And the water is flowing downhill all the way. Another thing, it's only pumped up once. When it reaches the end of the mouse's nose, it's pumped up to UV disinfection, and then it goes into the recycled water ponds. And again, that was another thing. I told the city they could sell this water, which they are doing. So they're actually not just paying to process the sewage, they're getting some money back from the recycled water. And so it's been a really successful project. I try to make all my designs simultaneously aesthetic, ecological, and functional, giving equal weight to engineering efficiency, community use, sculptural form, and sustaining the living world, which are all on the same footprint. I think it's important to remember that within the context of art, public park, and wildlife sanctuary, we're processing 16 million gallons of sewage a day. And we're also producing pristine recycled water, which you can see in the deep reservoir at the end of the mouse's tail. And then there, of course, this water is subject to evaporation so that there are other underground recycled water reservoirs. Biosolids generated from the process are used to enrich the land, and our recycled water irrigates local agricultural crops, including some famous Sonoma vineyards seen across the highway, which I think gives new meaning to the idea of designing for the living world. And if you look at those kind of rows in the background, those are Kendall Jackson vineyards that use our recycled sewer water. I think it's important to remember that within the context of channeling potentially damaging floodwater and providing safe passage for people and wildlife across massive highway barriers, you don't necessarily need to start with somebody commissioning a project. I began really sketching these things as a student. And I think one of the things, looking back, because I think we're often very unaware of what we're doing at the time we're doing it, I think one of the things I was doing was taking ideas from other fields and applying them to art. And I continue to do that. And that's why the projects are a little different than people who just basically their work is just framed by the aesthetic dialogue. And this project is called Flood Basins and Waterfalls, also from the 60s, and it's a design for a river that periodically overflows. Floodwater flows into a central channel where it spills over water steps, creating waterfalls, and is then stored in overflow basins until the flood subsides and water can drain back into the river. And so basically I was taking the whole idea of a public fountain, but turning it into something that would be both functional. You know, the waterfalls would be generated, but they would be generated on nature's timetable and not pumped water. So a different concept. And then this is done everywhere now, but it was unusual at the time. This is called Sculpted Floodplain, and this combines art, flood control, public open space, and living floodplain ecosystems in a series of wide, shallow basins along the course of a river. The forms define wet weather lakes and channels and dry weather playing fields and trails, providing public access and seasonal wetlands. Trail of the Spider Woman proposes a network of nature corridors for people and wildlife that travels over and under our national highway system, reconnecting disrupted ecosystems, diminishing roadkill, and preserving wild landscapes. And I actually worked at one point with a woman from MIT who was an advisor to I-90 between Albany and Boston. And she pointed out to them that all of the animal migration corridors were very well known. And why didn't they create safe passages for these animals? And they thought they would be too expensive. They weren't really interested in it. And so basically what they do is they send out trucks every day to these known corridors and pick up roadkill, which probably over the life of I-90 is going to turn out to be more expensive in the long run. And then Regional Highway Garden Nature Walk depicts a whimsical version of a vegetated highway crossing and rest stop. All of these issues explored in the 60s are relevant to the next project. And this project is now in construction. The Draw at Sugar House in Salt Lake City is a UDOT, that's Utah Department of Transportation, project, funded by improvements to I-80. The design is first perceived as two enormous images, a flower and a snake. The Sago Lily is sacred to the Mormons because its bulbous root prevented starvation during their earliest winters. And Snow's snake is based on a story told by Erastus Snow, one of the first pioneers to enter the valley. And of course, this was long before there were, any trails or anything into the valley. He describes crawling on his hands and knees through dense thickets and hearing the rattle of a snake coiled up under his nose. But, says Snow, as he gave me a friendly warning, I thanked him and retreated. And I've always considered it remarkable that he didn't kill the snake, that he gave the snake its own territory, which, is my philosophy, that instead of feeling so threatened by things, you just need to give everything its own space. The initial impetus for this project was a dangerous highway crossing that separates three residential neighborhoods, a popular public park, and a commercial strip with fast food and big box developments. Surrounded by parking lots lies a shady, sunken riparian corridor, a remnant of the original ravines that carried water off the Wasatch Mountains. And that would be that rectangle, that horizontal rectangle at the bottom of the screen, CSHBD1. That's Hidden Hollow. And here is Hidden Hollow in the summer when it's dry. Hidden Hollow, with Parley's Creek framed by willows and cottonwoods, is owned by Utah Open Lands, a conservation group. But again, it's an isolated, fragmented piece in the middle of the urban fabric. While 2 blocks south of Sugar House Park, I-80 entrance and exit ramps ensure a steady stream of high-speed traffic. Thus, a local trails group, the Pratt Coalition, has been working for many years to provide safe passage across the highway barrier between Sugar House Park and Hidden Hollow. Oops. And so the original design was simply a pedestrian tunnel under the 7-lane highway, linking the park and nature corridor with an easement between high office buildings. A high berm would have been required to keep rainwater out of the tunnel, but it soon became apparent that instead of blocking the flow of water, the art project could provide a controlled path for severe floods. This became a particularly attractive option to the city after a rain-on-snow event overtopped the Sugar House Park detention basin, which you can see here. You can see that slope and the lift gate along the highway. And this water spilled out onto the highway, which carried the flood water down to Temple Square. And so this was really my proposal. Thus, the Sago Lily was re-engineered to become a dam with 40-foot high walls that is now listed on the Utah Registry of Dams. The north petal tips over to become an overlook, The south petal forms a bus shelter, and a parapet along the highway offers a view of the plaza and entrance to the pedestrian crossing below, which is very important in terms of safety issues because it means you have some surveillance on the crossing. Floodwater breaches the dam near the confluence of stem and leaf paths, flows down a scour-resistant trail through a sunken plaza, then under the highway and down an armored canyon, the flood walls and spillway of the dam, rejoining Parley's Creek in Hidden Hollow. The model for both flood walls and spillway is Echo Canyon, one of the most famous landscapes in American history, traversed by Mormon pioneers, the Union Pacific Railroad, Lincoln Highway, and I-80. In addition to carrying the trail and floodway, our narrow sunken passageway has been designed to support wildlife and clean runoff from surrounding parking lots, and our contractor, Boulderscape, is experienced in building naturalistic infrastructure. So these are people who actually know the engineering, but they can also create the flower and the canyon. Snow Snake, with its tail wedged between rocky strata near the top of the canyon wall, oxygenates runoff from elevated parking terraces, which cascades in thread waterfalls from the snake's rattles into a pool below. And then that rattle part would be at the top. As the water overflows into a wide channel, limestone terraces, configured as snake patterns, purify the water and transform into an iris-filled rock reed filter and dense wetlands vegetation that double as wildlife habitat and stormwater treatment. And basically what a rock reed filter does is it's very dense rocks, and then the kinds of plants that you put in are bulbs. And so basically you have these enormous root zones and a lot of substrate, and the water is moving through a great depth of material of this substrate, and that allows a great deal of attachment by microbial decomposers. So you're basically providing habitat for the microbes that do the heavy lifting of water cleaning. And then the head of Snow Snake appears as an island in a pond, and an outfall channels stormwater back into Parley's Creek. And it turned out this was the original path of the creek, which was disrupted when they built I-80. So basically, we're also putting the water back on its original path. And if you look at those three colors, the black, the aqua, and the red, those are all that color. Those are three different colored pools. What is discovered as one moves through this interior street is a series of sculptural landmarks that guided travelers along the Mormon Trail. And so then there's a narrative that tells the story of the landmarks that they saw as they came, from the Mississippi River into the Salt Lake Valley. So Oil Spring, Copperas Spring, and Willow Springs are all real places recreated in miniature as habitat, art, and infrastructure. And this is a shot of the real oil spring. Basically what this is the oil shale that everybody would like to capitalize on now. The Mormons knew that, but they basically what they did when they came here is they greased their wagon axles with this oil that was seeping up through this stratified rock. And they were actually very good stewards of the environment, not just looking to extract things for profit, because along the trail they knew that other wagon trains would be following them, so they wanted to preserve the resources. And that's very clear if you read the journals. They actually provide maps and tell where the good water was and so on. And one of the other things that they look for in drinking water was frogs, because they knew that if amphibians could live in the water, then it was safe to drink and it wouldn't make them sick. Like Echo Canyon, our retaining wall is filled with ecological niches, perches, ledges, and nesting crevices, interwoven with planting pockets and small trees. Within the canyon, Cache Cave, a wall perforated with holes and filled with birds, whose chirping was recorded by countless Mormon journalists, and the witches, and that's down at the end. A group of erosional monuments unfold along the journey. And these are early sketches of the witches. Everybody drew the witches because they're so spectacular and dramatic. And one of these is by Frederick Piercy, who accompanied the Mormons and filled a sketchbook with all of these landmark places. And the other is a sketch by Thomas Moran, 19th century landscape painter. Placed along the busy highway, the 40-foot-high witches mark the entrance to the underground crossing and serve as a landmark that announces the location of Hidden Hollow. Because, of course, Hidden Hollow is depressed, a full story beneath the streets. The rest of these remnant ravines were filled in. They also provide housing and night roosts for colonies of bats, as seen in this cutaway sketch of a capstone. And so you wouldn't actually see the bats, but that area that's in shadow is actually open and the bats would enter from underneath. As the trail moves under the highway, other local features, coal seams, tree roots, fossil imprints, and dinosaur tracks are revealed by this cut through the earth, and the roadbed is replaced by twin slab bridges, opening up the tunnel to light and air. The highway overlook at the left focuses on a lily petal planted with Mormon crops, and the veins of the flower can be seen as both irrigation channels and the 7 rivers flowing into the valley. And I've actually written a trail guide for this project, which explains, it actually gives the quotations in the journals. So I'm just giving you a kind of quick overview of what's here. But as I say, there are 3 levels of small, medium, and large. It's almost like nested dolls. And so you can see it in many different ways. Viewed from the North Petals overlook at the top, the earthen walls of the dam stretch off into the distance like miniature mountain ranges. They frame the bowl of the Lily, forming a microcosm of both the Salt Lake Valley and the Great Basin. This is the view seen by the first settlers seeking a wagon route into the valley in 1847. They describe the Wasatch and Ochre Mountains running southward in abrupt parallel walls and meeting visually, like our spillway, at a low notch on the horizon. And the bulbous root of the Lily overlooks Parley's Creek as it snakes its way back to its source in the mountains, replicating the sinuous path of Snow's snake. If this seems like a bit too much art and history for a municipal project, consider the fact that a local developer is demolishing a small office building that adjoins the draw and replacing it with a 9-story mixed-use development that will house Westminster College students and contain offices and ground floor retail. And a second developer has acquired a long vacant site along Hidden Hollow, and that's below that green rectangle, with plans for residential and commercial projects. And something else I might add is that this project was the impetus for Salt Lake receiving federal funding for a trolley as alternate transportation. So, so this project has been very successful even before it was built in bringing money into the city. And community groups have worked tirelessly on behalf of the project, including these high school students, many environmental and public safety and trail groups, and young children who have trucked their model of the Lily and the Snake to countless meetings at the library and City Hall. And in the end, it was the tenacity of the community over many years that ensured this project got built. And this is the last project. It's called Mary's Garden, and this is obviously an overview of a very large site. And this occupies a site that was continuously mined by the Delaware and Hudson Coal Company for almost 90 years. The Marvin Colliery, occupying hundreds of acres on both sides of northeastern Pennsylvania's Lackawanna River, was a huge operation incorporating both the mining and processing
of anthracite coal. So all of that kind of brown is our site, and you can see the river with the trees surrounding it. The ecological devastation wrought during these long years of production included toxic ponds filled with black water from the Marvin's 2 coal breakers and brackish strip ponds gouged out by surface mining. The Lackawanna River, which can be seen in the background, contained no sign of life for many decades and eventually caught fire, as did the Culm dumps, mountains of waste rock and coal that burned continuously for 7 years. And one of the things that the residents told me about was when they would drive I-81 at night, they would know they were approaching Scranton because they'd see the glow in the sky from these fires that were continuously burning. And then other people told me that they couldn't go outside because the kind of sulfurous fumes were so terrible. So, and they're older now, but they say about when they were children, their mothers wouldn't let them play outside. Below grade, vertical shafts, ramps, and gangways connect 7 levels of underground chambers, including a well-known cave-in site that suffocated 8 miners and contains unrecovered bodies. So this is a pretty interesting site for an artist to get. In 1969, a small portion of this mine-scarred land, 40 acres, was purchased by an order of Catholic nuns, the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and the land became part of Marywood University. And because this was a reclamation project, I initially chose to focus on the sisters and their message of redemption. Thus, Mary's garden consists of sculptural configurations that form images of flowers associated with the Blessed Virgin, the Madonna Lily, and the rose. The project is loosely structured around the joys and sorrows within the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which is venerated by this order, and then extrapolated to the sufferings and steadfastness of the miners and their families. One of the key issues for me in this project was how exactly should damaged land be restored. The Madonna Lily occurs at the edge of a site that has recently been restored by the Pennsylvania Bureau of Abandoned Mine Reclamation. Volunteer trees and vegetation have been removed. The land has been compacted and terraced into platforms for athletic fields. Huge, oversized riprap channels conduct water off the land, and all traces of mining history have been erased, unlike the 5-acre wooded ravine that can be seen in the background. So one of the things I'm trying to do is contrast typical so-called land reclamation, which is what you saw there, and, you know, what I think reclamation should be, which is seeing what's there and then working with it and trying to solve the real problems, because the real problems here are things like acid mine drainage and, you know, I'll go over really serious environmental problems. Lying beneath these massive man-made terraces that the reclamation engineers did, which you can see in the background, the Madonna Lily will capture and store stormwater from the upper campus, and as in Dallas, will provide access to a constructed wetland filled with plants that purify stormwater. The 5-foot-wide paths over water will create microhabitats for wildlife and offer students opportunities for field study in phytoremediation, bioremediation, ecology, and aquaculture. The image of the lily is created from a composite of elements related to the formation of coal, acid mine drainage, the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and the history of the sisters who founded Marywood University. We know that coal originated in ancient swamps and that contemporary swamp plants and limestone purify water. A filter feeder found in ancient swamps, a crinoid, serves as the center of the Madonna Lily, with its long waving arms providing paths through the wetland. The crinoid star-shaped columnal can be interpreted as the Star of Bethlehem, one of the joys within the Immaculate Heart of Mary, while from a water quality perspective, the gold can be seen as pyrite, iron disulfide, one of the causes of acid mine drainage. The white color of the lily is both a symbol of purity as well as the actuality, since calcium carbonate and limestone neutralize acid and purify water. So I'm trying to work on multiple levels here and just, again, put everything on the same footprint, but it will mean different things to different people. As it proceeds toward the forest, the green stem of the lily becomes black and shiny, simulating the anthracite coal outcroppings found throughout the site. Okay, I want to go back to that one. Let me go back to this. One of the things that's really interesting to me is I'm not sure that anybody would necessarily see this as a damaged place, and yet it's totally man-made. I'm trying to say this is really beautiful, and it really tells the history of the place. So what I want to do is offer this alternate vision of land reclamation, and also preserve the mining history, also preserve the hardware. There's a great deal of mining accoutrements that are still out there, and especially the landforms that structure the site, which are a direct legacy of the dumping process. But I also particularly want to honor the resilience of nature. And I think you can look at this, and unless you knew the history of Pennsylvania, you wouldn't necessarily know what you're looking at. This is what you're looking at. Historic photographs, which I always look at to see where things come from, reveal the enormity of these cone piles, where 10 million tons of waste rock were dumped from each breaker every year. Women scavenged the piles for bits of usable coal at their own peril, since many were swallowed up in these unstable piles. It was also illegal. I think you can see the man on the horse there, and he would be a representative of the coal company, and they would actually get in trouble if they took these little bits of waste coal that had been thrown away with the waste rock. So, but they were so poor that they would go out and do it anyway and then run if somebody would come after them. Today, within the larger ravine landform, tall trees grow out of the tops of smaller dump piles, and the landscape is dotted with rusted pipes that served as ventilation for the 7 levels of subterranean coal mines. Now, here's a major environmental problem. Surface water does not flow on this site. Instead, it drops down through caverns and voids into the mine pool, a huge underground lake that underlies the city of Scranton and much of northeastern Pennsylvania. So the land is so porous that the water just gets sucked down. One of the goals of this project is to use this underground water, which remains at a constant 55 degrees year-round, as a geothermal resource to help meet the energy needs of Marywood University. Another goal is to restore surface water within the ravine as a life-giving source for plants, wildlife, and the Lackawanna River. Mary's Rose unfurls as a series of concentric circles following the natural topography of the tree-sheltered ravine down to its bottom. Formerly, a small creek flowed here, a tributary to the Lackawanna River, prior to the disruption of the watershed by intensive mining activity. Today, the path of the creek can still be seen, and the creek bed is often damp following rainstorms as water disappears into the mine pool. At the center of the Rose, a lined heart-shaped pool invokes both strip mining pits, which filled with water, and where generations of children skated and swam, as well as the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The pond offers life-giving water to wildlife, as well as reflections of the surrounding forest. A small spillway oxygenates the water as it enters the pool, which is connected on either side to the restored creek. The inner circle of rose petals serves as sculptural seating for students and visitors within this meditative and deeply historical place. Moving up the slope, the middle circle of rose petals reveals the coal mining geology of the Lackawanna Valley's Llewellyn Formation, with its layers of red shale, sandstone, conglomerate, limestone, and anthracite coal. Typical synclinal formations, recumbent folds, and overturned strata are both decorative and instructive, revealing the geological history of this place, while landscaping consists of plant pockets that nest within the fissures of the rock. The outermost circle of rose petals, the crown of thorns, is planted with brambles, roses and blackberries, and other local plants that were significant to mining families. They also provide food and thickets for wildlife and help buffer the sound of traffic along Oliphant Avenue. Just want to say, hematite nodules, iron concretions that are found throughout the geological formation, and that's not this, by the way. I better go back so you don't get confused. Oh dear. Well, okay. These hematite nodules, they're actually like small bowling balls, and you will find them in the creek bed and throughout the ravine. And these rust and drip like blood, recalling sorrows within the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And the topography of the ravine itself creates the sense of looking down into the center of the rose. Mary's Garden reveals the landscape where the healing power of nature stands beside the monolithic goals of typical land reclamation. During the mining era, Mary's woods were devastated and relocated as mine props within the caverns below. Today, the forest is slowly regenerating, and there is little hint of the wasteland of culm banks, slag heaps, poisonous waste ponds, or the many fires and deaths that occurred on this site. Paths through the ravine curl around and draw attention to remnants of the mining era, while honoring the work of nature that is reclaiming its own territory. By evoking the mining history at this site, the joys and sorrows of intertwined lives, and overlapping patterns from Carboniferous swamp to the present day, Mary's Garden underscores the fact that within an ecological community, every element is essential to functional well-being, and redemption is always at hand. Okay, that's it.
We're happy. Yes, we're happy to take questions from the audience. We have a short Q&A period, and I'll travel with the mic. And then if you don't get a chance to ask your question, feel free to chat with Patricia after the formal presentation is over in the Sonnentag Hall, where there's some lemonade and cookies left, we hope.
You mention and show pictures of the subsurface mining below Mary's Garden. What is the future of those levels? Are they going to collapse in on themselves and change the topography above them, or are they stabilized, or will they fill in?
Well, these are not. If you know coal mining country at all, it sounds like you do. I mean, there's a great deal of subsidence. And so people, for example, who own houses in this country, that, you know, you can't get any insurance for that. And there are many times where you'll see a house lying in a pit. And so this is a huge problem. What will happen if the coal company is responsible is they'll go back and fill in the mines, okay, so that the subsidence won't happen. But that's not going to happen in the case of this particular site. Now, what that means is basically there shouldn't be any problem for people just walking through. One of the reasons the university is not building on this site is because they can't. The land couldn't support a building, but it can support foot traffic. And so it's not really a concern for a garden or, you know, for the kind of project that I'm doing. Okay, it would be a real concern if you were trying to build on the site. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yes, Patricia, can you give some sense of how long it takes to complete one of these projects? For example, the Dallas, it had to take place over several years, I would think, right?
Well, they can take a very long time. They take a certain amount of time to design, but that's not where the time goes. Dallas took 5 years from the time it was proposed to the time it was dedicated, and that, in general, is not a very long period of time. When you're dealing with the sewer treatment plant that I showed, that was a $150 million project. In that case, it wasn't. It was basically financed by a state revolving fund, and then the city had some money, and the California Coastal Conservancy gave the money for my work. So it didn't take a long time for those reasons, but I find with every project, you can always guarantee that something will happen. They can take, a project I didn't show in San Francisco took 13 years. And that was basically another sewage project, but you wouldn't know it. It's a different type. It's a transport storage sewer for the city of San Francisco. And that one took so long because of the permitting process. There are a lot of environmental groups that, basically that's the reason they hired me, is they couldn't get it through without it becoming something else. And so it became a baywalk, and people don't even know it's a sewer because I buried it and you don't see it. You just walk on the roof. But they do take a huge amount of time. The project in Salt Lake has already had a number of problems. The drill shaft wall that was designed couldn't be built because for some reason the geotechnical surveys did not reveal the fact that the Utah State Penitentiary, when it was demolished, was dumped on our site. And so when the contractor started trying to drill, he hit a lot of reinforced concrete and they couldn't build it. So then, and these things happen. They can, they can take a long time for all kinds of reasons, but it's not the design process. It's other things. Sometimes it's raising the money, sometimes it's political problems. Each one is different, but they're not quick. Yeah.
On some of the projects, the vegetation is just gorgeous. Is this something you expect to have happen at Mary's Garden in a period of time where more animal life and more plants come in and things look so much more interesting?
Okay, well, see, Mary's Garden is the most recent project. It's just being engineered now. And it's such a complex project that I didn't even attempt to give you all the parts. But the plants that I'll be using in Mary's Garden are all, you know what a Mary Garden is, right? Okay, they're plants that are usually associated with the Blessed Virgin, but I'm doing those plants as well, and they're all very small plants. They're things like violets. They're like the bleeding hearts that I showed that are already on the site. They're very, very simple things, but then I'm relating them in terms of the symbolism, and I actually have drawings of that. So I've taken the joys and I've taken the sorrows, and I'm putting specific plants in, and we know what those plants are. And this is all based on a great deal of research. So, for example, one of the plants I'll be using will be Coronopsis coronarium, which is on the Shroud of Turin. Okay, it's just a little yellow daisy. It won't look like anything. But if you know, you know. And so I always try to develop these layers of meaning within the project. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but there is a whole program of what's planted. So there'll be the plants for the wildlife, like in all the other projects. There'll be the plants to clean the water. But the ones I'll pick are the ones that are also associated with the Virgin Mary. Okay.
If there are no more questions, I just have a pressing one. Did the mouse live?
Oh no, the mouse was eaten, but that's the point. You know, everything eats something. And as long as the mouse goes on, we don't want the mouse to die out as a species. But, you know, everything that's there is eating something. That's why they're there. So, for example, you know, we have a lot of birds in the ponds that are eating the fish that are put there from mosquito abatement. You know, so, but it's all part of the process. And if it's all balanced and the process works, then you save a lot of money on maintenance because you know, everything is policing something. Yeah. We have a lot of raptors on the site. I mean, I didn't show those. We have kites and eagles, and you know, and they, you know, really are really bloody, gruesome when they tear things apart, you know. But
are you comfortable talking about your upbringing or your education or some of the influences that brought you towards this wonderful work?
well, I grew up in an apartment, which is why I think I value parks so much. The only projects I really design are public work. I don't generally take projects that aren't going to have a public component. And part of that is I grew up in New York City parks. And, you know, and I thought that was nature. I didn't realize that they were designed. Okay. So, and then I went to Bennington and I saw real nature, Vermont, and absolutely fell in love with it. And my background is as a painter. And then my second degree is in 18th century art history. And then I began building work outdoors and realized I didn't know very much about that. So I went to architecture school to try to learn how to make a plan drawing and so on. I've always been very interested in structures. My father was an engineer. So I'm very interested in, I mean, I began with plants. And then what I do, because I design things that are, you know, not in the book, so to speak, I make models, and I see if the model can work. And generally speaking, if the model can work, then you can build it, you know, because you've already built it. So then it becomes a matter of fleshing out the details. And yeah, and usually people are engaged by the process because they've never done that before. So yeah, so I went from painting to outdoor kind of sculpture, and then Fair Park was my first big project. But the way I got that commission was I had shown just pen and ink drawings in a New York City art gallery, and Harry Parker, who was the director of the Dallas Museum, came in and called me and said, we must have, he said, are these buildable? And I said, oh yes. And he said, we must have one of these for Dallas. And so he invited me to come down to Dallas, and he said, this is our old mud hole. And he said, do you think you could do anything with it? And I said, yes. I said, what do you want? I said, you know, what's the program? What's the budget? He said, oh, do whatever you want. He said, this is Dallas. If they like it, they'll build it. And he was right. He was right. It was the easiest project I ever did. He showed the drawings in the museum. It was like a real art show. And various Dallas millionaires came in, hands encrusted in diamonds, wearing minks, and said, one in particular just came up and took me by the hand. She clearly didn't understand the project. They were just line drawings. She said, honey, where's the water? And I said, oh, that's the water, and this is sculpture, and that's... She said, I think it's marvelous, and don't you worry, we're going to build it. Well, there you go. Never happened before or since.
First question is, do you have a collection of your works that your people are able to purchase? A book or books?
Well, I don't, but there are some, there's one that's written by a Canadian woman. I mean, you could, Amazon would have things. Yeah,
yeah, if you just would go to Amazon, you would find books on my work. The one I would more recommend, if you're just interested in general things and projects, I would recommend Kath and Kelly's book, because it's more of a general book. The other one, the big book from Harvard, is really just about that series of drawings, that one series of drawings. And then there's going to be a new book that will be out in a couple of months, and that will have all the projects. And I think that will be a very good book, but it's not out yet. But Cavan's is pretty good and not very expensive.
And my second question is, do you know, are there people that are following in your footsteps for all the environmental corrections that have not yet been done, that will take a long, long time?
Well, probably, yeah. I mean, I don't really pay much attention to that, because I'm just kind of more interested in doing the work. And these projects are really, because, one of the things there's a lot of responsibility in putting things out there. They've got to work. You don't want to design a sewer treatment plant that doesn't work. That's not going to be good. So, and then the permitting process is pretty severe on most of my projects. You're dealing with the Army Corps of Engineers. And so even though they are art projects, they have these other dimensions, and they take a lot of time and a lot of travel.
Patricia, maybe you want to explain this lovely box set of books which I've been trying to nab all week.
That's the Harvard book. Yeah. How do people get hold of it? Amazon, I guess. Yeah. Shinwoo. Shinwoo. But those are just the little drawings. I showed some of the little drawings that I did when I was, like in my 20s. And basically what I did was I envisioned all the projects I would like to build. And it was a lot of fun. I made a couple of drawings every day. But they're ideas. They're all about ideas. So, yeah. And Catherine's book is more of like a biography with the projects.
Keep these out by the reception area if people want to take a look at them. All right,
Yeah.
Oh, one last question.
I'm going to cheat a little and make it 2 questions. I was just interested in your early work as an artist. You did these drawings, and then you said you were a painter, and I wondered what the nature was of the drawings and paintings. Were they always anticipating this work?
No.
And then, should I wait to ask my second question?
No. Actually, my work is a very logical progression, although I've never done the same thing twice. When I graduated from college, my goal was just to have a show in New York City on 57th Street, which was the best you could do at that time. And so as a student, I had been looking at abstract expressionist painters, huge canvases. And the canvases are very environmental. If you look at works by somebody like Jackson Pollock or Barnett Newman, they're walls of either paint or color. A Barnett Newman, a big one, like Via Heroica Sublimis, it's like a wall of red that hits you. So they're very environmental. So as an ambitious student, of course, I wanted to make paintings that were even bigger than that. But the style had changed, and so I was one of the first minimal painters. And if you go back, it was it was one style was following on another very quickly. So nothing lasted very long. Because art became very faddish at a certain point. But I was actually putting color into physical space and extending it as big as when I got a show in the gallery, I made the painting as big as the biggest gallery wall. And so, I had already pushed myself out of galleries and museums by the time I started. My first paintings were toured by the Museum of Modern Art. And they went to the Tate Gallery, the Kunsthal, and the Grand Palais in Paris. And these were minimal paintings. But I've always moved on. I've always pushed on. And so then I began doing outdoor work. And my first sculpture was 200 feet long. And it grew out of a dialogue with David Smith. And David Smith said that sculpture could only be vertical.
And I said it could be horizontal. And so it became this kind of male-female dialogue. So he said, okay, if you think this can be done, you go down to Albany Steel and Iron, tell them I sent you, and tell them what you want. So I couldn't, I didn't know very much. What I ordered was something called a structural T, which is, if you think of an I-beam, it's cut in half, and the kind of, stem of the T. Okay, I put some pipes in the ground down to the frost line, very simple, with a notch in them, and just slotted these T's down. So you got a line going back into nature, and painted it with red lead, bridge paint, very simple. But it was very, very beautiful and very mysterious because, of course, it kind of disappeared from view into the landscape. But what I learned from that was I started noticing how nature impinged on it. So, for example, if there was a pine tree over it, you'd get you'd be seeing the color against a ground cover of pine needles, and then pine needles would be gathering on the top of the sculpture. If it was under, say, a tree, a deciduous tree, the leaves would fall, they decompose, you'd get a little bit of soil, and pretty soon you get some plants growing there. And then in areas where it was wet and the rain was hitting, you'd get moss. And then I was noticing the light falling on it, which was very different at sunset or sunrise or in the middle of the day, whether there were shadows. So what happened was, by the time I did that first piece of sculpture, I was beginning to notice how the world was impinging on my work. And I've kind of gone on from there. I built, a lot of outdoor projects. I have a project at Storm King Arts Center that's just, big boulders, but they're things. They're actually biological. They're not just my invention. I do very little of my own invention. I always work with nature. I always use things that I can look at and think, what's the meaning of this and how does this work? Why is it the way it is? And so I've been doing it for a long time, but all of the things look very different. And now I've added a few other layers because I get more and more involved in specific places. And what is the history of the land and the people who lived here is always questions I ask myself. And I want that somehow reflected in the work. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Oh, thank you. It was a wonderful answer. My other question was, I had read that you did some work for Georgia O'Keeffe at one time, and I wondered how you found each other. Is there a good story there?
Okay, well, actually, when I graduated from college, I've always been very interested in learning more and more and more. So I wanted to get a master's degree, and I did. And it was the first year of student loans, the National Defense Student Loan Acts. And so I took out a loan, but now I had to pay the loan back. So since I really didn't have any credentials or anything, what I did was I became a researcher for people who were writing about art. And I spent all day at the Frick Art Reference Library in New York. We'd close at 4, then I'd get on a bus and go down to the New York Public Library, which in those days closed at 10. And I'd get home at like 11 and start my own work. And that's how I paid back the loan, by doing all of this paid research and learning a lot. So it turned out that Georgia was a good friend of the librarian, the head librarian at the Frick, which is a very fancy institution. And she asked her for recommendation for somebody who could help her catalog all her news clippings and paintings. She had never done that before. And so I was introduced to O'Keeffe, and I used to meet her when she'd come to New York, which she came quite frequently because she would look at the art shows. And we really liked each other, so I went back to Abiquiu with her, and I lived with her. And so that's how I knew Georgia O'Keeffe. And she was an amazing, wonderful person, not at all like those severe photos that you see of her. That was an image that Stieglitz told her. He said to her, she should be as much of an image as her paintings, so that people would recognize her when she walked down the street. And so for her whole life, she had one dress. That was the same dress. That was not a different dress. And the hem would go up and the hem would go down. But when people would see her, they would recognize her. They might not have any clue as to who she was or what she did,
but they knew she was somebody that they should know. And it was because of the costume. So, but she didn't dress that way at home. So, yeah.
You have a question.
How did you became so famous, and how did your art become so good?
Well, I don't really think of myself as famous. I don't think you ever want to do that. You just want to think of yourself as a hard worker and solve problems. And that's a good thing to be, I think. Be a helpful person.
Give a big round of applause for Patricia, and hope you can join her in the salmon tank.